All right. Good afternoon and happy Friday, everyone. In just a few minutes from now, we will be hearing by VTC from Dr. Peter Salama, the Deputy Director General for Emergency Preparedness and Response at the World Health Organization. And he'll talk to you about what the World Health Organization is doing regarding the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's not quite ready to come on the line right now, so I'll start with my portion of the briefing first, and then and take some questions, and then the guest will come on. So first of all, a reminder: the Secretary General, accompanied by the Deputy Secretary General, is convening today the 14th seminar for his current special and personal representatives and envoys, which is taking place in Montpellier, Switzerland. Next week, as we informed you yesterday, he will travel to Mali, where he will spend Peacekeepers' Day next Tuesday in Bamako, with troops and personnel from the UN mission in the country, MINUSMA. And also to remind you that Monday is a U.S. holiday and UN headquarters will be closed. There will be no noon briefing that day. The Secretary General has taken note with concern the latest report on the downing of MH17. He underlines that the Security Council, in its Resolution 2166, demanded that all states cooperate fully with efforts to establish accountability. In such instances, establishing the truth about this event is an important part of achieving justice for the victims and their families. You will have seen that Matthew Nimitz, the personal envoy of the Secretary General, spoke to reporters a short while ago about discussions he held over the past 1.5 days with the foreign ministers of Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. He said that while there is as yet no final resolution of the issues have been narrowed. He noted that both sides are determined to try to reach an agreement and that they are working very hard to do that. The UN mission in Libya has condemned the car bomb attack that took place today in Benghazi. The attack targeted a populated residential neighborhood and left at least 7 dead, including a toddler, and more than 10 injured. This week has seen a series of ruthless attacks in Libya. The mission reiterates that there's no justification for such attacks, which may amount to war crimes, and that those who have organized and enabled this attack must be brought to justice. The mission stands in solidarity with the people of Libya in resisting attempts to spread fear, intimidation, and hatred. The UN is committed to a Libyan-led political process that will strengthen a unified Libya and build trust and mutual understanding through peaceful and inclusive dialogue. In Somalia, the United Nations and its partners expressed concern over today's armed clashes near the Tukarak area between Puntland and Somaliland. The UN is urgently calling for an immediate ceasefire from both sides and for the start of dialogue between military commanders on the ground. Our colleagues there noted that violence is taking place amid an already difficult humanitarian situation that has recently been aggravated by the impact of tropical cyclone Sagar, and the clashes only add to the suffering of the people in the area. Our humanitarian colleagues in the government in Ethiopia are today highlighting critical response priorities and funding gaps following a review of the humanitarian situation in the country. The gap analysis shows that $280.4 million are urgently required to ensure life-saving response for the coming 6 months. Humanitarian partners are focusing on the need to further scale up response to over 1 million people displaced by conflict over the last 12 months. An upsurge in conflict since early September 2017 in the border areas of the Oromia and Somali regions came on top of 2 years of back-to-back drought. Overall, the Ethiopia Humanitarian and Disaster Resilience Plan seeks $1.66 billion and is currently 34% funded. Yesterday evening, Mark Lowcock, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, said in a statement that he's extremely concerned by recent developments in Yemen, where over the past weeks we have seen an escalation in conflict, growing restrictions on humanitarian action, and a reduction in essential commercial imports. He said that more than 22 million people in Yemen need humanitarian assistance or protection. Some 8.4 million people are severely food insecure and at risk of starvation. If conditions do not improve, a further 10 million people will fall into this category by the end of the year. Mr. Lowcock calls on the government of Yemen, with the support of the coalition, to take active steps to boost commercial imports of food, fuel, and humanitarian supplies through all of Yemen's ports. He also calls on the government of Yemen to take steps to ensure that all public servants receive their salaries wherever they are in Yemen. And he urges all parties to engage meaningfully with the United Nations, without preconditions, to achieve a lasting, negotiated settlement towards sustainable peace. And I think I have something on the Central African Republic for you. Our colleagues from the UN mission in the Central African Republic tell us that investigations are ongoing in Bria, in Haute-Koto Prefecture, where earlier today UN police arrested an anti-Balaka leader on suspicion of involvement in an attack on a formed police unit patrol that resulted in the death of a peacekeeper in December last year. Meanwhile, the UN mission reports that the situation in Bangui is calm today following violence on the 23rd of May. The Central African Republic Internal Security Forces are investigating the violence with the support of UN police. Also in the capital, the mission reports that peacekeepers on Wednesday intervened and prevented the lynching of a family in the 2nd District. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Rad Al Hussein, welcomed the ruling issued unanimously in Guatemala against 4 high-ranking former military officials for crimes against humanity, aggravated sexual violence, and enforced disappearance. The case is known as the Molina Thyssen case. In 1981, Emma Guadalupe Molina Thyssen was detained at a military checkpoint and subjected to torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, as well as sexual violence. She escaped, but her 14-year-old brother, Marco Antonio, was then taken by force from the family's home in Guatemala City and has never been found. The High Commissioner said the ruling was a milestone judgment for Guatemala and beyond with regards to the investigation, prosecution, and punishment of serious human rights violations committed by senior military officials during an internal armed conflict. You can find more on this case on the High Commissioner's website. Today is Africa Day. In his message for the day, the Secretary General said that Africa is increasingly driving its own future and highlighted the relationship between the African Union and the UN. Over the past 2 years, both organizations have signed agreements on peace and security, as well as the implementation of complementary development agendas, he said. The Secretary General stressed that what is good for Africa is good for the world and called on all nations to support peace and prosperity in the continent. His full message is available online. And for the honor roll, we have scored a century. Thanks to a payment from Myanmar, the honor roll has reached 100. So are there any questions for me before we go to our guest? Yes, please.
Thank you. Adam Classfeld from Courthouse News. Just wanted to get the Security Council's feedback on 3 alarming reports out of the United States involving immigration policy yesterday. Yesterday there was some Senate testimony that U.S. officials lost track of nearly 1,500 migrant children. There was another report from the American Civil Liberties Union that ICE has a reported intent to destroy abuse records and is trying to do that through NARA right now. And there was another report about the new policy of forced separation of families. There's been some gripping reporting showing mothers wearing yellow bracelets and ripped away from their children. What has been the United Nations response to the developments on this forced family separation policy and the missing children?
You'd asked about the Security Council, and of course I don't speak for them, but regarding the Secretary General, what I can say is that he once more has made clear the need to treat all refugees and migrants with respect for their dignity. That is particularly true in the case of children who are, as you know, in an especially vulnerable position. And so their concerns need to be listened to and respected by the authorities, particularly in cases where they may be isolated from their families. Yes.
Thank you. Japan. I want to talk about this children in situation in Gaza. Gaza, where there are 61 people killed during this recent, uprising over there. And the thing is, the children are still, as you said earlier, most vulnerable. What is the situation of the children, and how many children are still incarcerated by the Israelis? Do you have any update on that?
Yes. As you may have noticed, the special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Nikolai Mladenov, briefed the Security Council just a few days ago, and he included some information about the situation of children, and he made it clear, again, the need that in their cases they be promptly tried or else released. He spoke out against the sort of indefinite detention we've been seeing in different cases, so I'd urge you to look at his remarks. The figures are similar to what I'd told you about a week or so back. That it's a little over 200.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Last week, when the Secretary General had met with Trump, did they discuss this migration policy, the U.S. migration policy?
I don't have anything to add to the readout that we put out at the time.
So you don't know if they discussed it or not?
We put out a readout. That's as much as we
Can I ask about Yemen?
You can after someone else has had a chance. Yes.
Morning, Deepak Arora from the Tribune Online. As you're aware, India is the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping forces, but UN also owes the largest amount of money to India. So could you give us a status? I mean, how do you propose to give the dues to India, and when?
The UN tries to pay off all of the peacekeeping contributors as promptly as we can. We get money through, as you know, through our various assessments, and then pay them to the respective governments, and that process continues. And so, if there are any debts being incurred, we try to clear them as swiftly as we can. Yes, you.
To ask you, I'd asked Stefan about whether the UN's envoy on Libya, Ghassan Salame, has been reported there, declined to speak with civilians in Derna. And I wanted to ask you, it wasn't much in his briefing to the Security Council, and people there say that, in fact, the hospital has no more oxygen because of the siege laid. So what is the UN's position on General Haftar's siege? And number two, I've gone back and looked, and it seems that Mr. Salame, at least as of 2016, was on the advisory board of the UAE's Diplomatic Academy, where now Bernardino Leon, the former envoy, has a position. And I wanted to know, there's nothing since then, and there's no Ghassan Salame financial disclosure online at least, to disclose his outside activities. Is he still affiliated with the UAE Diplomatic Academy, given that the UAE is supportive of General Haftar? And number two, what does it say? Was this some kind of a problem, his affiliation with the UAE, given their influence in Libya and position in Libya? Positions on Libya?
Well, first of all, regarding what you said about Mr. Salame and this report that he did not, that he refused to talk to Derna representatives, we've checked with the mission. That report is false. Mr. Salame and the mission have been in touch with several people and entities from Derna, and they are ready to speak to all Libyans.
Can you say which entities? Because the groups went on the record saying that he wouldn't speak to them. So I just wanted to know, can you say which groups those are?
This is the information I have. But he has been in touch, and he continues to be open and available to talk to all the various parties, including in Derna. We do not believe that there's any problems with any conflicts regarding Mr. Salame. He was vetted during the course of his recruitment.
Did he stop his position as being on the advisory board of the UAE Diplomatic Academy when he began working for the UN?
As far as I'm aware, there are no conflicts regarding his roles. Hold on. First, Dulcie, and then...
Yeah, thanks. So Mark Lowcock's statement, are there any details when he says that conflict has actually increased? And are any of the ports open? Is the airport open in Sana'a? And has the UN started to use the $985 million that the Saudis gave about a month ago? Thanks.
We have started using that, including the money that has gone to the World Food Program. Okay. All right, so we'll go. I see that our guests will be ready soon, so I'll go for one more quick round of questions. But yes, we are using the money, but there are tremendous problems in access. There's a very lengthy press release that Mr. Lowcock put out yesterday with some more details, so I'd encourage you to look at that. Yes.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question to the one from earlier. Was the Secretary General apprised specifically of yesterday's testimony before the Senate of the missing estimated 1,500 migrant children? And a follow-up to that one would be, have there been any kind of international efforts to locate them?
Well, he is aware of these reports. Obviously, it's up to the authorities to follow up, and we trust that they will do so thoroughly. Yes, Ibtisam?
Yes.
No, Ibtisam. That's not you. Yes.
Hi, Masoud. Farhan, two questions. One, a follow-up on Yemen. I know that you said that he issued a longer statement, but could you please say something about who is mainly responsible for not having the aid delivered, and to which extent the coalition is cooperating with you? And on the second question on Gaza, which steps is the Secretary General is taking actually to try to ease the siege, especially that despite the fact that the Egyptians are saying that they are opening or trying to open the border, there are very little number, or the number is very limited of people who can cross the border. Thank you.
Yes, on the first question, as I pointed out this just earlier, Mr. Lowcock has called on the government of Yemen, with the support of the coalition, to take active steps to boost commercial imports of food, fuel, and humanitarian supplies through all Yemen's ports, and wanted the government of Yemen also to take steps to ensure that all public servants are paid. Regarding your question on Gaza, as Mr. Mladinov made clear a few days ago, we are encouraged
to the conference.
by the government of Egypt opening border crossings, as well as by the increased use of the Kerem Shalom crossing, and we're trying to get as much activity through those points as possible. Yes.
Sure. And could I just ask, obviously we're interested in the Ebola thing, but can you take questions after that's done? Because there's more questions on Cyprus and Egypt.
Just get your questions now.
Okay,
we're doing them and then going to a guest.
Okay, I just heard you say that you were going to take one fact.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. The UN's website now discloses an additional case of child rape by a civilian contractor of the UN in Mali. And I wanted to know, it doesn't, unlike for military personnel, it doesn't disclose, one, the nationality, and two, it doesn't, it's a pretty serious charge, and the Secretary General is obviously going there for the day of the peacekeeper. So I wanted to know, what's the nationality of the contractor? How did the UN become aware of this? And what, in this serious instance of alleged child rape, what is the UN going to do about it?
I don't have the nationality to share with you. What I can say is that MINUSMA has received a report of sexual abuse involving a national civilian contractor. So this, I assume from that what the nationality is, but it involves a national civilian contractor. The allegations refer to the rape of a female minor, resulting in her pregnancy. The incident allegedly took place at an unspecified date in 2018. Ensuring the provision of assistance to the victims is our priority. The victim has been referred to UNICEF and an NGO partner for appropriate medical, psychosocial, and legal support. The mission also stands ready to provide additional assistance as needed, and the allegation is currently being investigated by the Office of Internal Oversight Services.
If, in fact, the contractor is Malian and the victim is Malian, why would not this be a criminal matter for actual prosecution in Mali? Is the person given immunity simply by being a UN contractor? What is it, like, for example, what was this person doing for the UN?
You would have to ask the Malian authorities whether there's any criminal prosecution being
the
followed
UN
up
say
in that case. That is a matter between the contractor and the government of Mali. I've given you the details on our side.
Well, what was the contractor doing? You say he's a contractor, just to understand a little bit better how someone could get immunity for child rape. What services were they performing for the UN?
I didn't say that any... first of all, there's not immunity for crimes that are committed. Second of all, I didn't say that immunity was in play.
There's no immunity from local prosecution.
You would have to ask. No, it's not by the UN. Like I said, it's by a national contractor. Second of all, you would have to check with the Malian authorities whether they're following up with criminal charges.
Farhan,
yes.
Yes, just to follow up on Yemen again. Has the Secretary General or anybody high authority has had any conversation with the Saudi coalition or the Saudi government about stopping these attacks, which are still going on, whether you like it or not?
We have been in touch with the various authorities, and again, I'd urge you to look at what Mr. Lowcock says, where he has also remarks about the attacks and the actions by the coalition. Yes.
Deepak Arora again. There have been ups and downs between a summit between President Trump and Kim. Is Secretary General thinking of a role so that this historic peace opportunity is not lost?
We stand ready to be helpful as needed. The Secretary General made clear in his remarks yesterday that we'll all need to have nerves of steel, and he hopes that this process can go ahead and lead to progress on the peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Yeah.
Just a clarification on Yemen paying all the civil servants. Does that mean those under Houthi control in Sana'a or what?
Wherever they are located. All right, and now let's go to our guest. Is he online?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
What? Yes? Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Is that Dr. Salama?
Speaking.
Oh, thanks very much. We're ready to hear from you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Peter Salama, the Deputy Director General for Emergency Preparedness and Response at the World Health Organization. Dr. Salama, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So let me talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo. First of all, a bit about the context, because this Ebola outbreak is happening in the context of one of the longest running and largest humanitarian crises in the world. Of course, in the DRC, we have population displacement, massive food insecurity, malnutrition, as well as many outbreaks, not just Ebola. There's been cholera this year, polio, measles, and several others. So the context is a humanitarian crisis, particularly, of course, in the eastern part of the country, centered around Kasai and the Kivus. So on that context, on May the 8th, we were notified by the Ministry of Health of the Democratic Republic of Congo of 2 lab-confirmed cases of Ebola, the Zaire strain, which had occurred in the Bikoro health zone in Equator province in the northwest of the country. That's a province with around 2.5 million inhabitants, covering a very forested, extensive area of around 100,000 square kilometers in that part of the country. Of course, this is not the first outbreak of Ebola that the DRC has had. It's had 8 previous outbreaks. The most significant one was in 1995 in the city of Kikwit, which killed around 250 people. So why is this outbreak different, and why are we so concerned? 4 main reasons. The first is that the outbreak has affected an important rural urban center known as Bandaka, with a population of between 1 and 2 million people. The other important factor related to Bandaka is that it's on the River Congo, and that means it has connectivity right through to Kinshasa and connectivity to both Republic of Congo on the other side of the river, and also to the Central African Republic, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, is affected by its own internal conflict and has very weak infrastructure. So the worst case scenario is, of course, a sick person is transported down the river to any of those locations, and we have the seeding of the outbreak into many different places. The other factors that make this different is the infection of 5 healthcare workers. That's tragic in its own right, but it also bodes badly for potential amplification of the crisis, because we know from other crises when healthcare workers get infected, they can spread the disease very quickly. The other major complexities are to do with the fact that now we have 4 different epicenters in play. So rather than just focusing all our resources in one place, we have to focus on 4 separate locations, which is really a complex, an added complexity. And finally, this is a very remote rural location. Logistics is very difficult. When we visited there 10 days ago, we had to take a UN plane to Bandaka, then a UN helicopter to Bikoro, the epicenter of the outbreak. Otherwise, we would have been spending literally days in a 4-wheel drive or many, many hours on a motorcycle. That's the only other way. There's really very few paved roads, very little power and infrastructure. In terms of the data to date, we have 52 cases. That includes all confirmed, suspected, and probable cases, and 22 deaths. The most recent information overnight is we have 3 additional suspected cases and 1 new confirmed case in the small village of Iboko, which has become an expanding source of infections. We did have an alert in Kinshasa. Fortunately, that's proven to be negative, and we hope, of course, that Kinshasa will continue to be unaffected. We're actively following more than 600 contacts in all of the locations. In terms of the response, after May the 8th, in the space of around 48 hours, we initiated an incident management system at all levels of WHO and in coordination with the government of DRC. We were able to advance within a few hours $2 million to start the response, to supply personal protective equipment to the teams on the ground, to get to Bandaka and Bikoro. We were able to advance international emergency health kits, and we were able to set up a mobile laboratory. Since then, we've been steadily scaling up, and we now have around 140 WHO staff on the ground in the DRC, including almost 60 in the city of Bandaka and another 11 in Bikoro, and we're continuously moving to get our staff to the most peripheral locations where they're most needed. In terms of the major pillars of the response, it's basically the standard pillars of an Ebola response with an added extra this time that I'll speak about. So it's case finding, it's surveillance, it's safe and dignified burials, it's community engagement, it's logistics, of course, and it's clinical care and isolation. The additional element that really for the first time has become integral to our response is the use of a new investigational vaccine for Ebola. That's extremely important because it gives us something to offer communities in terms of protection that we simply weren't able to offer as part of the response in past outbreaks. But it adds complexity. It adds complexity in terms of how we communicate the use of this vaccine, because it's not for everyone. It's for contacts of confirmed cases. And it adds complexity because of the logistics. This vaccine needs to be kept at between -60 and -80 degrees Celsius. And you can imagine in the context of a densely forested region where there's very little reliable power and electricity, that in itself is a major feat. We started the vaccination campaign on May the 21st in Bandaka, because that's the urban centre we're most concerned about protecting as a first priority. And so far, the vaccination program is going well. In the first ring, for example, in Bandaka, we're able to reach 152 of the 171 target contacts. The vaccination program is still going, and we'll aim to reach all of them, but that's already almost 90% in that first phase. So that means the community is accepting the vaccination program by and large very well, and we need to continue with that outreach because it is an extremely important part of the program. In terms of priorities for the next phase, it's really to continue with the vaccination program, continue with that detective work of identifying every case, ensuring it's lab confirmed, ensuring we identify every contact, continuing to engage the community so they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and they're really part of the response. And of course, the logistics element. For the first time tomorrow, we'll be able to actually get in place a staff accommodation in some of the most peripheral locations, such as Iboko, because it's been impossible to expand the team because there's simply nowhere to sleep for our colleagues on the ground. We're also scaling up the response in terms of the region. There are 9 countries that we've rated at high risk that are neighbouring countries of the DRC, and we're working to deploy teams in each of those countries so that each of those countries prepares well, and particularly with the first priority on the Central African Republic and the Republic of Congo. There is a strategic response plan in place. The budget for that has increased from last week, where it was $26 million, to today, where it's $56 million, and that's kept pace with the expansion of the outbreak, and particularly the involvement of the urban centre, Bandaka, which has really complicated our response. This is not just a response of WHO, it's a response led by the Democratic Republic of Congo's government, particularly, of course, its Ministry of Health, which has been very decisive and very responsive to the outbreak, and of course has a range of key partners, including Médecins Sans Frontières, UNICEF, WFP, and the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, amongst many others. It's really a multinational response at this point involving many other agencies. I'll stop there and pause for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we'll take some questions now. Please identify yourself to our speaker. Yes, Evelyn first.
How do you do? Evelyn Leopold, and I welcome you on behalf of the of the United Nations Correspondents Association. My question is on Donald Trump and U.S. funding. He's told Congress not to fund Ebola, including money left over from Obama's emergency fund. Part of it, of course, is his obsession with former President Obama. But National Security Advisor John Bolton also said he didn't believe WHO should be funded. Sweden and Germany, among others, are trying to take up the slack. But I'm wondering what impact in the Congo and its neighbors, as well as who as a whole, this declaration might have.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of the specific declaration that you're quoting, but what I can tell you is the US government has already donated more than $1 million to the WHO Ebola response, and is actively considering other grants, not only to WHO, but to WHO-supported partners. So we've seen actually a very responsive stance from the US government agencies, particularly USAID. The Center for Disease Control is highly involved and was already working with us on the ground with their experts under a WHO umbrella. And we have the NIH as well involved, as well as several other US government agencies. So the response from the US government agencies working with us, I can say, has been very, very forward-looking and very much cooperation with the WHO and the UN system.
But Congress has promised to defund Ebola funds.
Yeah, I think you're referring perhaps to longer-term funding around global health security. And here we're talking about an outbreak and an outbreak response. And the US government, as I said, has already advanced money to us and already has indicated that there's further funding in the pipeline for Ebola.
Sure, thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. Thanks for doing this by video on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. I wanted to ask you if you could explain, some people, it seems like the Director General of WHO on advice declined to declare it a public health emergency of international concern. And what's the upside of that, given how serious you're saying that it is? What would that have done to make it easier, or why is it a good thing that he didn't make the declaration? And the other, also, there are these reports of people that I guess escaped. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't know if they were incarcerated, but they got out of a facility and they are infected. What are the ramifications of that, and what steps have you taken? Finally, I'd hope to actually ask the Secretariat about this, but you're talking about the crisis in the Congo. It seems like there are now posters of Joseph Kabila posted in Kinshasa, where saying that he's going to be a candidate, even though ostensibly he's not supposed to be a candidate. I understand you're with WHO, but if you can, is that part of the crisis? How does the political turmoil, as opposed to just armed conflict, how does it impact your ability to respond to the crisis, to the health crisis? Thanks.
So on the declaration, it's a very specific declaration in WHO's international health regulations called a FAKE, a Public Health Emergency of International Concern, which has certain legal implications. And we make that declaration on the independent advice of a dedicated scientific committee. And their advice was that as serious as the situation is at the moment in DRC, it, in their opinion, did not meet the criteria to define it as a public health emergency of international concern. That does not mean, by any means, this is not a top priority. In fact, this is WHO's top priority at the moment in terms of all of the emergencies in around 50 locations that we're responding to. So it's a top priority. Now, what it would have done is given WHO added legal impetus, particularly when we're discussing with countries any additional travel and trade barriers that they're trying to levy on the Democratic Republic of Congo, which WHO at this stage does not recommend. But there's a downside as well, and certainly in the discussions that came up, which is when we use that label and when it's advised, it is rare, and it carries with it a certain sense of panic. And so in the West Africa Ebola outbreak, you will recall that many airlines, for example, stopped flying to the countries affected, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And that affected the ability of responders to get into the country. It also had a huge impact on the economy and the ability to get supplies into those countries. So there's definitely a balance, and we take the objective advice of the scientific committee. But they also were very clear that this is not a one-off discussion, that they'll be reviewing these criteria and reviewing the situation very closely over the days and weeks to come. And if the situation deteriorates, then they'll certainly be reconvened, and they may offer a different opinion at that stage. In terms of the second part of the question on DRC, certainly, as I've described earlier, DRC is in a protracted crisis. Now, there are many, many proximal causes of that crisis, but what I can say is that given the fragility of the country, that has had a major impact on the health services and of the social services in general in the country. So there has been a huge underinvestment in particularly rural areas of the health system because of the situation in the country for many, many years, if not decades. And that, of course, has downstream impact on our ability to respond to an outbreak such as this.
Good afternoon. This is Deepak Arora from the Tribune Online, India. While WHO is making efforts to eradicate polio, measles, etc., newer and newer kind of viruses are appearing in the world. For example, the Nipah virus, which just hit one of the southern states of India, Kerala, and over 12 people have died. Now, what is it, your advisory, or what would you like to, how would you like to ensure that, how to tackle these viruses, newer viruses, like Ebola, of course you've talked about it, about Nipah, which have appeared probably in the other parts of the world also earlier. And now I'm told, just a little while ago, that Nipah virus hasn't come from bat virus. You know, it is from somewhere else. Probably this gentleman was working in Middle East. So what's your latest on this? Could you please brief us on that? Thank you.
So you're raising a very important point, which are there are a range of diseases. We call them high-threat pathogens. So they're diseases for which, by and large, they have a very high death rate. So they kill more people than survive the illness. And also, they tend to have very few available technological options. So very few vaccines, what we call medical countermeasures, very few drugs, very few options for healthcare workers to use. And we've consolidated that list of the ones we're most concerned about in a list of diseases that we put into something called the Research and Development Blueprint. And what that is the real priorities for WHO of these killer diseases for which we have very few countermeasures. And in fact, Ebola is one of those on the list. The other viral hemorrhagic fevers are, and so is the Nipah virus, actually. So we're seeking to prioritize both the response to these outbreaks, but also the research and development. So over time, we have more options available to us to help people be protected through vaccines or to survive through drugs and therapeutics. And certainly in the case of Ebola, we've seen that strategy pay off. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have an investigational vaccine that we're using in this response in DRC, and we also are very likely to trial certain drugs that have been used in the West in previous outbreaks for Ebola, where responders have gone back to Western countries, and we've seen that some evidence that the drugs can really be helpful in increasing survival. So similarly on Nipah, we have a new outbreak, as you mentioned, in Kerala state of India. From my information as of this morning, the main source of that outbreak had been determined by the Indian authorities, at least reportedly, to be from fruit bats. There was indeed some additional human-to-human transmission in the setting of healthcare and in the setting of close contacts with family members. And the Indian authorities were very confident that they could control this outbreak, but we are discussing with the Indian government this approach of using the outbreak, because it's a disease for which we don't understand a lot, to look at trials of vaccine, or trials, more likely in this case, of therapeutic drugs to increase survival rate, and also learn more about this disease for which we have huge holes in our scientific knowledge.
Yes, Maggie?
Hi, Dr. Salama. It's Margaret Bashir from Voice of America. Just two questions. You keep talking about the vaccine, but I don't understand, because for most of us, when you get a vaccine, it's to prevent getting a disease. But if I understood you correctly, you're saying you're only giving it to people who have confirmed cases of Ebola. So could you just explain for the layman how that works? And then on containment, you were saying about the flights from the previous time it was problematic, but you were talking about the river and worrying about people spreading the disease on the river. So are there any restrictions? Are you considering restrictions? Is the government considering restrictions on river travel until this is contained?
Yeah. So on the first question, you're quite right to ask what the strategy is for vaccination. And in this situation, it's not mass immunization where you just go into a geographical area and vaccinate everyone. This is a very targeted strategy. It's called ring vaccination. and it's based on the program that eradicated smallpox in the 1970s. And really what the strategy is you take a confirmed case or a probable case, and then you map out in a very detailed way every person that has close contact, that has had close contact with that confirmed case. So they're usually, of course, family members, carers, healthcare workers, burial workers if the person died, lab workers, and perhaps priests or traditional healers as well. So all of the close contacts of that case. And then you vaccinate those close contacts. And then as a second phase, you vaccinate the contacts of those contacts. So really what you're forming are protective rings around that case. Now, it's not going to benefit the actual confirmed case because, indeed, you're right, it's a vaccination, so it's a preventative strategy. But what it does is to help prevent the transmission to all of those contacts and contacts of contacts. And that benefits the individuals, but it's also a strategy to stop transmission further through communities. And that's what eradicated smallpox, as I mentioned. And we found that strategy was extremely effective in research trials done in Guinea and West Africa a couple of years ago. And in fact, there were no confirmed cases in those vaccinated after 10 days of vaccination. In terms of your second question, just remind me again, I'm sorry?
About the river,
yes, the river.
Not spreading Ebola through the river travel.
So really good question. So important to differentiate the regular travel and trade barriers for which there's very little evidence that it has any impact. So for example, if the neighboring countries around DRC tomorrow try to close all their borders or stop all trade with DRC, from an evidence point of view, there'd be very little evidence to suggest that would have any impact. A broad closure of all borders or stopping all trade of all commodities with DRC. And actually it would probably be detrimental, in fact, because by stopping the economic movement would actually make the situation worse in DRC, as I've mentioned already, a country affected by a crisis. But what we do recommend is screening. And so, for example, on the Congo River now, we're setting up at 80 separate points on the Congo River screening for sick people. So that includes checking on the temperature, checking on their symptoms, because what we do know about Ebola is that when people are symptomatic, that's when they can spread the disease. So if we can detect fevers on the river at certain screening points or other symptoms of the disease, that's where we have an opportunity of intercepting, if you like, sick people coming down the river, ensuring they end up both in isolation so they don't spread the disease further, but also importantly in care so that they can have a higher survival rate from the care that we can give, which, as I mentioned, is both symptomatic, so rehydration and improving their clinical situation through giving them fluids, but also increasingly we're looking at quite sophisticated drugs that are on offer to improve their survival rates.
So have you actually found anyone symptomatic on the river in these checks? Oh, sorry. Have you found anyone on the river through these checks that's been showing signs of Ebola? Has it worked?
So already they have found symptomatic cases who are suspected, and we're waiting for the lab results on some of those cases.
Dulcie?
Yeah, just a question about the number of dead. Can you break that number down by gender and age? Thanks.
I'd have to get back to you on the specific age and gender breakdown. What I can say is it's 22, and there's a tendency for more men than women associated with this outbreak, but I can send you the very specific numbers after the call.
So I'd again like to thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Salame, for the briefing, and best of luck in dealing with the Ebola crisis.
Thanks so much.
And before we head out, I would like to turn you over to my colleague Brendan Verma, the spokesperson for the President of the General Assembly. Ayeji.